Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here with the 139th episode of the Writ Podcast. We're probably only a few days from an election call in Canada, and the landscape has shifted pretty dramatically in the last few months. Justin Trudeau is out, Mark Carney is in, and the Liberals have moved into the lead in the polls. So there's a lot to discuss, and joining me today is the Pollster Panel. Dan Arnold is Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara and was the Liberals pollster in the last three federal election campaigns. Andrew Enns is Executive Vice President at Léger, and he conducted polling for Stephen Harper's Conservatives. And James Valkey is Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints Research and has worked on many central NDP campaigns. How you guys feeling with just a couple days before a writ drop?
I mean, I'm feeling good.
Yeah.
James, how about
Inevitable. It's happening this year.
Yeah, Mark Carney said it's happening before November, and I think it might be much sooner.
I don't know if Mark Carney has a throne speech written, so I suspect we're into a campaign within the next week.
James, has Mark Carney called Jagmeet Singh to work out a deal to try to get things? Is he waiting by the phone?
The things that happen behind the scenes, I'll never be able to tell you, Eric.
All right. So, Dan, I'm sure you're a bit more upbeat. You've been on this podcast now for a little while, and usually you were the doom and gloom person on the panel. How are you feeling after this change? I'm sure you did not see this coming.
Well, honestly, no. Not to this extent anyways. I think it was foreseeable that with a leadership change, the Liberal numbers would go up a little bit. I think that was something that would be expected. There's a lot of pent-up frustration towards Trudeau, and he leaves. It kind of like puts changed voters back in play for the Liberals to some extent. But I think, look, we've had this conversation several times over the past year, and I have said that as long as the ballot question was inflation, cost of living, the Liberals really had no way to win the election. Like, the ballot question had to change for the Liberals to be in the game, and thanks to Donald Trump, the ballot question has changed, and as a result of that, I think the Liberals are back in the game at least. How it plays out, I think we're in for a pretty unpredictable election, but it certainly looks like a competitive one.
Dan, how much of that do you think is Trump? How much do you think of it is Carney?
I think it's a whole bunch of factors that are interconnected. So we did a survey a couple of weeks ago at Pollara, and we asked people first, are you feeling better about the Liberals than you were a couple months ago? And there's about a third of Canadians that said, yeah, I'm more likely to vote for them now than I was a couple of months ago. And then we asked the follow-up question of why. And there were four answers that rose to the top, and they all had similar shares of people who said them. You had because Trudeau's leaving. We had because I'm excited by one of the leadership candidates. Now, maybe there was some Frank Bayless momentum below the surface there, but I think it was probably Mark Carney, if we're going to put a name on it. We also had people who said yes because of Trump and tariffs. And then actually the number one reason was people who said, I'm feeling worse about Pierre Poilievre than I was a couple of months ago. So I think by Trudeau leaving, it has put the spotlight a bit more on Poilievre than was there before. Before, he was just not Trudeau, and that was enough. I think now people look at him and maybe, they never loved him, and now they're looking at some of the attributes that maybe previously fit the moment are not really fitting the moment right now when Trump is on the scene, right? So the guy who talks in slogans, the guy who is a bit of a disruptor, a bit of a populist, doesn't appeal to them as much now as it did a couple of months ago. So I think all of these factors kind of interconnected to each other are all part of the reason for why we're in the situation that we're in right now.
Andrew, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I would agree with in terms of some of that, some of the changed environment. I mean, certainly Dan's, Dan's initial point about, I think we did a podcast in December, and it was, Happy New Year, and this is going to be a boring election whenever it does happen, and then Donald Trump, came onto the scene and completely upended things, and I think. I will probably maybe disagree slightly with Dan in terms of the Pierre Poilievre favorables. We asked that question in our poll this week, and it hasn't changed. His favorables and unfavorables haven't really changed much over the probably 5-6 months since we last did previously. But as Dan pointed out, it's the context now of where Pierre Poilievre and his message is fitting in, and. It was a very effective message, sort of that agent of change. And as Dan says, sort of a bit of that, let's go in and break a few things to get things right again. Common sense, sort of conservatism, that sort of stuff is now, it's out of step with this sort of, our country is, legitimately and philosophically feeling under attack. By a fairly large neighbor. We're David in this Goliath fight, and it's not, the disruptor, the shake things up kind of mantra is just as Dan says, it's just not quite in sync with the times right now, and that's presenting a problem in terms of even getting a voice in the conversation now is proving very difficult. And I will also point out, Dan, I think you were pretty busy in the Ontario election. We were doing some media work, and Bonnie Crombie, I thought, ran a good campaign, but she couldn't get in on the conversation. And same with Merritt Stiles. They couldn't get in on the conversation on what was really driving the media narrative and sort of this overarching voter kind of perception on the tariffs. And it, no fault of their own. Like I think strategists looked at it. I think they tried. They tested messaging. But the reality is, opposition leaders can't go down and meet with governors. Like, it just doesn't. What are you doing here? And so, that's Pierre Poilievre's challenge here. And I suspect they're hoping that the election period allows them, at least they'll get equal billing, which right now, Jagmeet and Pierre don't really get equal billing in terms of the conversations about, what Melanie Joly's doing or what LeBlanc is doing down in Ottawa. So it's been a tough couple months, and I'm sure lots of consternation in the conservative back rooms, but it's the reality.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you looked at the Ontario election, just Google search trends, Google search terms. Ford was getting 5 times more searches than Crombie, 20 times more searches than Stiles during the writ, which is really, like, I've been checking this on provincial elections and federal elections for the past 5 or 6 years, and the top 2 leaders are always within, like, maybe twice as much, maybe 50% more, but never a factor of 5 more. So he just monopolized the entire playing field in that campaign.
And
James,
even
go ahead.
In the last meeting, I said the Trump tariffs would be a black swan event if they come true, and it sure as hell did, right? Like, we can look at Ontario and see what happened there, but moreover, and far be it from me to pump Léger's tires, but I think they released a poll a few weeks ago, and they had Carney's name as the Liberal leader, and they had they tested it with Trudeau's name as the Liberal leader. Who would you vote for? And I think even with Trudeau's name as the federal Liberal leader, they still got 31%, and that's head and shoulders above they were doing a month and a half ago, right? So a certain amount of this is conditions, my dear boy. Things have changed. That's a big factor. I do think that some of the Liberal leadership, like the federal Liberal Party, has smashed the emergency vent button of the nuclear steam powered machines on people not liking Trudeau and the carbon tax, and they hit them hard. Both seem to have relieved energy, and now we're looking at a situation where things are very different than they were a month and a half ago.
Yeah, no, it's just remarkable to see the kind of movement we've seen in the polls over the last little while. James, just to stick with you for a second, and maybe we'll go back in reverse order. For the NDP, I mean, there's been a huge gain in support for the Liberals, but there's been also a drop for the Conservatives and for the NDP. So, what do you think has caused the NDP to go from being 18 to 20% to now 12, 10, depending on the poll?
Sure. I mean, I would use the same conditions that I just described. Like, Trump has upended the turnip truck, and the Liberal leadership has changed the constitution of the political solution, like what's out there in the ether. I mean, for the New Democrats right now, so first and foremost, many New Democrats have long memories, and when Dion came in as the leader, New Democrats dropped to 12%, and people screamed from the balconies. And when then Ignatieff came in, they dropped to 10% and was described as a death spiral for the New Democrats. And lo and behold, they're still kicking. So I think for New Democrats, it's polls go up, polls go down. But I think in the context of what's happening now, and to what Dan said, like in Ontario, it almost became an incumbent narrative. And right now, the issues for New Democrats are Trump, tariffs, and Musk. and I add Musk intentionally, because what the New Democrats have done is they'll need to fight for attention and be a bit more creative. They, about a few weeks ago, they said that Trump should be uninvited to the G7 that we're hosting later, and they got a lot of attention for that. They forced the government to respond. It was a multi-day story, and they're going to need to keep pushing out stuff like that to get into the narrative, to bust through, to see where they contrast with the other parties. And given the direction that Carney has been steering the Liberal ship, I think there's probably more space for New Democrats to build that contrast point of view.
Andrew, the Conservatives have gone from being, just at about the time when Trudeau resigned, they were in the 45 to 48 range. Now they've seemingly dropped about 5 to 10 points, right? Who do you have any sense of who the people are that they've lost just over the last couple months?
I don't have a strong feeling. Although I would say, just looking at some of the crosstabs, I mean, the older women who were a little slow to come across from the Liberals to the Conservatives are probably, that's usually how it often works in this sort of thing. The last ones in are usually the first ones off the bus. And the other group that I've noted that's interesting is certainly that 18 to 34-year-old cohort has also started to shift. I think there's certainly some movement there in terms of again, a little bit of that new leader and enthusiasm around that new leader. And the issue, right? I mean, the American standing up to America, that sort of thing. Regionally, I think it's interesting to look at where some of that vote has moved. And again, it's not the Conservative vote so much, but we haven't talked, like Quebec is quite extraordinary. Liberals are, in our last poll, are up, 40% in Quebec. They haven't been there anywhere close to that since 2022. And again, I think it's that dynamic of, we think Canada's under threat. Well, if you're defending the French culture, I can tell you, Canada is viewed by hardcore separatists as a bit of a hindrance in terms of their growth and development. Americans, that's a big challenge. Like they are a threat for real, as 51st states. So they have responded accordingly in terms of rallying to what they feel in Quebec. And Poilievre doesn't have a lot of traction in Quebec, never really has. So, I think that's where, and for the Conservatives, I think 48% was high. Like, I don't think that was probably sustainable. 42 probably was comfortable, and I think they felt that was pretty reliable. And now, they're under 40. And combine that with, an NDP ballot right now that it's at 10 or 12, that's a big problem. Because, it's not just progressive, it's not just NDP vote that's shifted Liberal, but the Greens are down by, I think almost 50%. They're down in our last poll at 3%. With the BQ moving, like that combination spells trouble in a bunch of ridings for Conservatives, particularly when I think about the GTA where, the NDP typically need to be in those mid to high teens at best to try to get those splits. This is a problem now for them for the Tories to start counting up those seats they need to form government.
Just, you mentioned Quebec, we've seen polling from Léger showing that support for sovereignty has dropped. So I do think that view of stability versus change, risky, stuff has had an impact on the bloc. And you just mentioned that, like, one of the things that, sovereignists and nationalists in Quebec often refer to, what they don't want is to become Louisiana, right? For Francophones who to become like Louisiana. So it does kind of show why maybe the United States would be seen as even a bigger threat than English Canada. Dan, so Andrew's kind of mentioned it. There's been support that's come from the Bloc. There's been support coming from the Conservatives. There's been support coming from the NDP. And that is what is pushing the Liberals now to over 40 in a few polls. Obviously, it's a good thing to be that high. But does that make it harder to keep all of those people together? Because they're from across the spectrum, almost literally.
Yeah, I think it's a tenuous 40% if we're saying the Liberals are at 40% right now. And, tenuous because it's people who are not voting for them 2 months ago. So, they can change as Andrew said, last in, first out. Like, they could certainly change their minds quickly. No, I don't think people know a ton about Mark Carney. I did a poll. This was again before he won the leadership, but at the time it was under half of people said they knew a few things about Mark Carney. They may know a few more things now, but I'm skeptical that people, because he's seen as newer on the scene, unless you have posters of Bank of Canada governors up in your bedroom, you probably didn't know anything about him until a couple of months ago. So I think impressions of him are still forming, and there'll be attack ads, there'll be debates, there could be missteps. I think people's opinions of him could certainly change very quickly because he's not a known commodity. I think by now everyone kind of knew what they felt about Trudeau, and Carney they don't know. So I think these numbers could certainly soften. The one thing that I do think is maybe a bit more encouraging for the Liberals, though, is if you asked about the demographics. Carney is very popular with older voters. If you look at the crosstab of who knows him, who likes him, who feels he's best to deal with Trump, who feels he's best in the economy, all those types of attribute questions. It is seniors who are by far the most positive towards him. And, they turn out. They're also a bit more rooted in their opinions, generally speaking. So, I think that gives him probably some hope that some of these gains will hold through a campaign.
Dan, stick with you and we'll go back around the horn. So if the issue set has entirely changed, it's now about Trump, it's now about tariffs. First of all, how sticky is that as an issue? Can it stay there until April 28th or May 5th or whenever the election is? And how is Mark Carney positioned against in light of that change of issue?
Well, Donald Trump might just become a wallflower for the next 2 months and to stop doing media and kind of be low bridge. That seems unlikely. So I think it's going to stay as an issue for the next little bit. It seems very unlikely that this is going to go away anytime soon. So, I think that's there. I would say it's not universally. I think there's still, if you look at kind of, again, crosstabs, the most important issue, a lot of younger voters are still more concerned about inflation and housing and other issues. So I wouldn't say it's universal, but certainly when we're talking about those seniors who like Carney, who are concerned about this issue, I think that's going to be the dominant issue for them for this foreseeable future. Sorry, what was the second part of that?
Yeah, how does Carney how does he fit into that issue?
He seems like he was genetically created to fit into the issue. Ultimately, people want somebody who seems mature, seems serious, has experience in crises, has experience in these types of situations internationally. Like, he seems like the right fit for the moment. That's that's certainly what's working for him right now. So I think it all lines up nicely. Sometimes you kind of have to force the ballot question you want onto the election. But in this case, the Liberals are lucky. The thing that people care about the most is also the thing that the answer to the ballot question is really basically the guy they have right now, which is why he did so well in the Liberal leadership race too, I think.
Andrew, do the Conservatives need to get into that issue, or do they need to try to make the election about something else? Like, what do they have to do here? And how does Pierre Poilievre line up in this new issue set that they weren't expecting?
Well, I suspect that's somewhat of an open debate still, but from my perspective, I think they do need to sort of get themselves into this issue in terms of leadership, national leadership, and the strengthening the Canadian economy in light of the challenges coming from the U.S. I think Dan's right. I had suggested to somebody that perhaps Jagmeet and Poilievre should pen a letter to to Carney to suggest that Trump should calm down for 45 days, let us have a Canadian election and get a solid government in place, and then he can pick up his rhetoric and challenges, right? It'd probably be good for Singh and Poilievre to have some peace, but it's probably not going to happen. So I think this is important that if you've got, which is typically the case in elections, the leaders, especially the mainstream leaders, get some equal playing time. So Poilievre's going to have to get a message that's going to have to find the voice and the message and get in there. I'm not convinced that like Dan's right, affordability and those things. Particularly if tariffs come into effect on April 2nd, like affordability could resurrect very quickly because grocery prices could be impacted very quickly, and that could present a more immediate and more personal challenge to voters. And again, maybe changes this narrative, slightly, and maybe changes it in favor to Poilievre, who's been comfortable speaking to this, in the past 18 months. But nonetheless, he has to prepare himself for a campaign that deals with sort of getting Canadians to feel that he is a comfortable, strong leader for the country, with a plan to grow the economy. I think Dan said it. I mean, the slogans and some of the triteness, carbon tax, Carney. I'm not sure. I mean, if I'm looking at our polling, which I don't think they're necessarily looking at our polling, they probably have their own, but I'd be looking at that going, I'm not convinced that message is turning, is getting us into the conversation to the degree we need it to. So yeah, they need to probably pivot a bit and get back on the economy. I saw those numbers too, Dan, and we ran some on the economy, and I think it's not a good spot if Mark Carney's leading Pierre Poilievre by 10 points or better on who's best for the economy. It's
very rare that a liberal or a progressive leader is ahead of the conservative leader on economic management.
I will, just a slight little partisan jab here, but it's really not based on any past performance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe on Mr. Carney's performance, he can claim something, but from a government perspective, I mean, they really don't have much to hang their hat on when it comes to economic performance.
James, how does the NDP, can the NDP get in on this conversation, or do they need to hope that the conversation changes?
They're in on it right now. That, to my mind, the big X factor. Yeah, Trump is going to impact it, and the tariffs are a thing. But the big X factor is, who the hell is Mark Carney? As Dan said, he's positioned on the economy in polls, and his resume speaks for itself. But I'm a Leafs fan, and if it looks good on paper, it doesn't always mean they're going to perform in the regular season or the playoffs, right? And Mark Carney has...
Come April, you never know.
April.
This is coming
Listen,
April
as a
now,
Jets fan, I know all about come April, and then comes golf season.
We're diverging. Mark Carney has been living in a fantasy world of Technicolor. He has been living in a vacuum. He has not come in contact with reality yet. Nobody actually knows. From what I've seen, he's pretty freaking boring when he's talking, and he can get a bit snarky. Like, there's a little bit of chip on his shoulder. They're working to smooth that over, and it looks like he's receptive, but ordinary Canadians have no idea who this guy is whatsoever. If you put a poll up to say, do you think Mark Carney can walk on water? You're probably going to get a non-zero answer yes to that, right? Right now, that's the X factor. Conservatives have... I just dipped into their ad library on Facebook or Meta. They have $150,000 buy on one ad in 49 different regional demographics. Huge buy. All contrast ad against Carney, otherwise known as attack ads. New Democrats just released their own ad about red flags about Mark Carney. It is a race to define who Mark Carney is, what he can do and what he can't do. Because right now he only exists in theory. He doesn't exist in reality in face of most Canadians, and that's what's going on. And then the question becomes: is he capable how big is the Trump factor going to fit into that equation?
And I will say, and Dan touched on it too. I mean, the knowledge of Mr. Carney is been largely driven by a very consistent media kind of description of Bank of Canada, Bank of England, economist, businessman. And that's kind of it. So I'd say there's sort of kind of broad but shallow sort of appreciation. And that is, and Dan will know, I mean, those blank slates, present opportunity to sort of define it. If you're the Liberals, you can fill in those blanks and meet the moment. But you can also, the opposition can also get in the mix and start painting on that canvas as well.
He's an empty vessel right now, and people are projecting what they want onto him. He's got momentum, and he better call the damn election soon if he wants to keep that rosy glow, because the longer it goes, the bigger chance that bubble is going to pop.
Well, yeah, that was and just a quick, is there any reason for Carney not to call the election by the end of this weekend? Does anybody think that he won't or that he shouldn't? Does everything just kind of argue for going as soon as you can to try to,
Dan's got vacation plans early April, maybe? I'm not sure.
Any inside knowledge?
I think he's got to go. I will give you the counter argument just so it's on the table here. And I remember in 2021, I was one of the people that was arguing the loudest, I think, internally to go early and call the early election for the Liberals that time around to capture the moment and the mood that was going on around COVID. But we just weren't ready. There was no physical way to get an election going in May or June of that year because the candidates weren't nominated and the team wasn't ready and the platform wasn't ready. And as it was kind of rushed, and it felt a little rushed, I think, on the outside too. So, and this is even more rushed, I think, right now. But so that's the only thing I think that would possibly be holding it back as a consideration would just be the logistics of it. But in terms of the moment, you got to go with the moment when the moment is there, and for the reasons that James talked about.
I also get it. I also think it gets awkward with the leader of the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister, lurking around the lobby, shilling for interviews.
We didn't put his name forward.
And it probably isn't a look that Canadians would go, well, I don't get this. He's Prime Minister.
You can watch from the gallery, yeah. Okay, so I want to move on to not so much the campaign that's going to come and the messages and everything, but you've all been in party shops with polling being done. And so I thought it might be useful for listeners and viewers to get an idea of actually what the parties are going to be doing for the next 6 weeks when it comes to polling. Dan, now, I don't know, and you can say whatever you like, what they're going to do. You may or may not know what the Liberals are going to do over the next 6 weeks. But in your experience, what has the Liberal Party done when it comes to the polling side during election campaigns?
Yeah, so I think from experience, what I would say in the pre-writ phase, and luckily the pre-writ phase in the past has been several months to do all this as opposed to just 2 weeks. So it's a tighter timeline. Although I'm sure the Carney campaign was doing research during the leadership. It wasn't like he came out of nowhere and won this leadership by surprise. So I'm sure a lot of these pieces were probably being put into place over the past couple of months. But as you get closer to a campaign, you're testing a platform to see not just what's in the platform, but what are the things that actually pop. You're only going to be able to realistically communicate 3 policies in an ad or in a campaign trail. So what are the 3 things that pop and actually excite people? And that's probably via focus groups and some surveys and things like that. You're obviously testing your ads to get your ads ready for the campaign. We did a lot of visual testing as well too for Trudeau. You'd show pictures of people of him in different situations and measure kind of the reaction. Do they like the pictures of him kissing babies and shaking hands, or do they like the pictures of him at a desk, or different situations to sort of figure out what are the types of events we need, what are the type of visuals we need. So and that's again surveys and focus groups. You can do that, and then I think they got to be thinking about what is the actual pathways to victory right now. What are the ridings? It's a new, as you spent hundreds of hours analyzing, Eric, it's a new map compared to the last election campaign, and also a map that has been shaken up because there's new leaders, and we said some demographics have changed, right? If the Liberals are doing better among older voters, but worse among some multicultural groups, that changes the map as well too. So, they're obviously doing survey data to kind of map out what are the ridings that we think we can win, what are the ridings that are competitive, what are the sort of the long shots to keep an eye on in the campaign. In the last couple of campaigns, if you look at the end of the day, the Liberals have a very enviable record of winning those close races, and that's largely because they were able to identify what are the close races going to be, and let's pump the resources into that. So I imagine all of that is what's frantically going on right now as part of the election readiness process.
And then during the campaign, is it usually tracking polls of particular regions, particular ridings, nationally? What's usually the process?
Yeah, I think, a federal election, all the parties, if you look at the spending returns, they've got a pretty big research budget. They can afford to do a full tracking program. I did the New Brunswick election in the fall. We talked about that. Was we did 2 surveys during the campaign. That was all the budget they had for research during the campaign. It wasn't nightly tracking. For a federal party, they are going to be able to do nightly tracking. What that sample size looks like and what the methodology looks like will kind of depend, I guess, depending on the researcher and what their preferences are. But we were doing national tracking. I think a few times we kind of no offense to people who live in rural Alberta, we did slice out a few regions of the country, but we were still trying to cover most of the country, because you never know when things are going to kind of take off during an election campaign. Like, I mentioned somewhere else in another podcast, I think the Liberals have a shot in Vancouver Island this time, right? So you don't want to ignore that just because they haven't won there before. So you want to make sure you've got pretty good coverage to see what's going on, getting those nightly tracking questions in there. And then you also have the opportunity then, if you're doing polling every night, to slip questions on and on, right? If something happens during the campaign, you can actually see how people are responding to it. You can see what's getting traction, what people have noticed, what they haven't noticed. And I think you'd also probably, for the same reason, have a series of focus groups kind of all set up during the campaign so that you can get those regular touch points, because advertising is an ever evolving process, and there's probably new creative coming out every couple of days. So you want to have a place where you can test it easily. You want to have a place where you can kind of test reaction to announcements, to policies as they happen on the campaign. So it's really just at this point, I think, kind of setting up all of those pieces so that you have regular touch points with voters during the campaign to see what's happening and to test emerging policies, ads, creative ideas as they happen. It's useful too. Like I remember again 2019, blackface happened during the campaign. We had focus groups happening like that same night, so we could get an actual reaction to what was going on. And it happened to be a group of racialized voters in the 905. So we got very lucky there in terms of that. But having those kind of touch points planned in advance gives you the opportunity to quickly measure how events are happening and being received by voters on the campaign.
Andrew, you're now, I guess, more on the media side and, the glamorous media side. But when you were back with the Conservatives, what was the approach for the Conservative Party when it comes to polling?
I won't go in. I mean, like a lot of what Dan said is like no mystery. The parties, there's a lot of duplication in terms of that, the pre-writ activities. I think, when I think about the current situation, what's probably going on, I would imagine that they're being fairly aggressive in terms of the pre-writ, because for them, I think there was a point where they had the polling was quite stable throughout 2024 in terms of where they were at. So they had likely done some work in terms of where does this current sort of 20-point lead over the Liberals present in terms of seats that we probably haven't won before and probably need to sort of understand a little bit because we haven't campaigned as hard in them. They're probably looking at that again, wondering about, okay, where do we retrench a little bit because the dynamic has changed. And then there'll be a fair amount of call work going on as well in terms of just trying to understand, the messaging a bit here. Again, we talked about it earlier, that the dynamic has changed. And so they'll be looking at the existing messaging, understanding where it works and where it's not anymore, and maybe trying to tweak, and also looking at where else to go. The Conservatives, in my experience, sort of a few campaigns, tend to be a bit more, much more focused on sort of the key battleground areas. And for the Conservative Party, it's really largely been that 905, maybe that outer metro belt, the Etobicoke and Scarboroughs in Ontario, lower mainland in British Columbia, and carve out most of Vancouver. That's not really of a whole lot of interest, but sort of the Surreys and Burnabys. And then with the occasional foray into eastern Quebec City, and that would so they'll probably identify a collective of ridings. It might be strategic, but there's usually a regionality to these ridings, and they'll set up a nightly tracking program, and then to Dan's point, they'll be blocked in evenings of qual as well during the campaign, at least up to the first couple weeks. After that, qual becomes, it's a little, you're maybe hearing stuff, but your ability to action it can get a little limited as the time starts to run out. Campaigns get kind of blocked out in terms of the stages of the campaign, but certainly, and I think this will be a campaign, I think it has all the trappings for a fairly unprecedented and somewhat unpredictable roller coaster-ish kind of campaign, because we have an individual that is not a Canadian but has the ability to just shake things up quite considerably based on what he says. He's got the imagination and attention of Canadians, and he's a very bad man, and he can do disruptive things. And so from a party perspective, you may want to you may need to get in and just try to understand, like, is this, what does this mean for, for me, my candidate? I mean, I read this afternoon, apparently Mark Carney's the preferred candidate to win the election for Donald Trump over Pierre Poilievre. I don't know, Dan, friends like that, maybe who needs enemies?
Well, we had Barack Obama endorse Trudeau the last couple of elections. That was helpful. I don't know if it would play the same way today.
But it's I mean, certainly it's a lot of nightly work and a lot of stress and of course I become a bit of public enemy number one to the campaign teams, because the last thing they like seeing is these media polls that pop up, and suddenly it's like not quite what they're doing, because they're tracking only a fraction of the country, and so but their candidates are seeing our polls and going, wait a second, this isn't what I'm seeing, what's going on? And it can be a consternation, but that's being the media.
I can speak
spot,
from experience. Right? There's a lot of cursing of media pollsters that happens on campaign teams. Never Léger. To be completely frank, Léger's numbers have always been very close to our tracking the last couple of elections. But whenever there is a media poll that's a little bit different, there's a lot of consternation, freaked out candidates, people on the campaign team wondering what's going on.
Everyone's very level-headed, Dan. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'll challenge you as well, Dan. I actually think a Obama endorsement would be very good for Poilievre this election.
Well, we'll see if he gets involved. James, for the NDP, the NDP traditionally has, fewer resources than the other parties, and the campaign tends not to be as national, right? So do they take a different approach to polling, because for the NDP, the target list might be a bit smaller?
Yeah, I mean, these are smart gentlemen. I would echo everything they said and jump off of Andrew's comment, is that with any polling, I don't think the Conservatives are going to be doing a lot of research into Davenport, for example. But they probably will be in Southwestern Ontario and Northern Ontario. New Democrats equally find regions where they think there are movable. I'm going to back up. What you want to do in an election for research is find out who is in your universe and how you get them to vote for you. From that premise, all research falls under that umbrella. It's a function of money and how much you can spend on it. It's a function of how much time you have to spend it. But to a certain degree, as what these gentlemen said, are very similar. Research has changed over the last 20 years, especially in the quantitative side of the equation, where rolling pollings of households was very consistent. That's changed to more online. Now there's more of a hybridization of research. There's online ad testing. You can really move stuff quickly with lift testing, sentiment testing on certain ads. Like if an ad is working particularly well against, red, orange fence sitters, if it's moving them, then that's who you target in the ad buy, right? You don't send that to blue, orange fence sitters. And similarly, so there's a bunch of hybridization of information. Campaigns take so much information in throughout the campaign. It's quantitative and qualitative as part of that. I would say that, and Dan mentioned this, is that the focus groups are critical to any campaign. You can get into the sentiment. You can unpack things that are just simply not quantifiable in a survey without taking a leap of faith on what your premise is. For example, in Ontario, Doug Ford has a personal brand that elevates him above a party brand or people's sentiment for change, or the way people think of the province has been going for the last 7 years under his tenure. You get that in focus groups, in phrases that stick into your brain and you can't rattle them loose. The difference is that focus groups bring outside voices, fresh voices into a campaign that many very insular campaigns just don't hear, and it is like a watershed moment to refreshingly hear from real people in the real world about it. So, but other than that, the gentleman mentioned programs that are very similar across parties.
Okay, we'll end on this, and I feel like I do need to insist. I'm not going to hold you to anything, but I want you to tell me your gut. What does your gut say is going to be the outcome of this election? If I'd asked you this in January, you would have all said the exact same thing. Now, I'm curious, because I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know what even my gut is saying. What do you guys think? Who wants to bite the bullet first? No takers. I'm gonna call on people. I'm gonna voluntold.
I'll
NDP majority, right, James?
I am going to say that the electorate is very volatile, and that is a result of volatility south of the border. Most Canadians are not paying attention to big P politics, and there's a lot of the chattering classes who think they know what the outcome is going to be. And we saw in Ontario, things did not follow the plan as was described. So I don't know what that means, other than to say that, like, look, I'll give you one lesson from Ontario, is that the public sentiment was that they are sitting on a couch with a comforter on while the world is burning around them, and all they wanted was another comforter. And what many thought that meant was that Doug Ford's going to win a supermajority. What that actually meant is the people that had re-elect on their sign had a better chance of getting re-elected. So what does that mean for the federal campaign? I don't know, but the public sentiment out there is hard to distill, and as a result, Eric, I am unable to predict a firm outcome of the election campaign. I mean, and then we get into scenarios where hypotheticals about non-majority situations start being asked of leaders, and their response could also impact the outcome of said election campaign. There's so many factors; it's impossible to judge.
All right, Dan, Andrew, anything more, less jello-y?
Honestly, it could go either way. I mean, I was walking around at the Liberal leadership announcement, what was it, a week and a half ago, and everyone asked me, "Well, do you think we can win?" And I said, depending kind of how much alcohol I'd had over the course of the day, my probabilities kept going up higher and higher, I think, as the day went on. But I think at best, even though the Liberals right now and all the projections seem to be leading, I think at best it will be a 50-50 for them. I think if anything, Poilievre maybe still is the favorite just because of some of those changed fundamentals. And we talked about Carney being untested. There's usually a leadership bump. I mean, this has happened in every leadership race, and the bump usually goes down, right? So I don't think by any means, like you see some polls that have the Liberals winning Alberta. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there's going to be a bit of a come down at some point from that. But, there's definitely a clear pathway to victory and a clear pathway to majority for both Poilievre and Carney, and it depends how they perform in the campaign at the end of the day in terms of how that plays out.
Andrew?
Yeah, I would, I would agree. I think it's interesting that momentum will factor in at some point. I think Canadians will gravitate to who they, if there's a feeling that there's going to be a winner, and there's a campaign that's starting to get a bit of that aura, that they're on a bit of a roll, that there's been a trend of a couple of good weeks and supported by some movement in the poll. I think Canadians are going to, again, because of what's going on in this U.S.-Canada relations, are going to gravitate to a majority government. And so I think that's the notion that this, when we're sort of, it could go either way. One would think that minority is a real possibility, and I was thinking about that too. But I also feel that there is a sense that Canadians are going to want to try to get to a majority here, to get this, to get a strong mandate. And I think you've got an interesting dynamic with a polished professional individual, but a real rookie politician leading the Liberals. And James talked on it. He's had a couple little skirmishes in the media, but so far he's conducted himself very well in terms of being on the public stage, and he's got as Dan said, he's the right guy for the moment. But he's still pretty unpolished, and I dare say I don't know how many real voters he's actually sort of immersed himself in so far. I mean, all due respect to Liberal voting members, I don't know if that's necessarily the general population that's out there. And on the flip side, you've got Pierre Poilievre, who, he's a politician. He's got that experience, but he's coming into this thing. like he really, I think he, and I'll probably get the emails are already probably filling my inbox, but I do think he has to change his approach a bit. He has to adapt to the current situation, and that is going to present a challenge. And can he do it? And can he do it in what, even the initial salvos from the Liberals? I mean, those are pretty good attack ads. The Trump comparisons. I've picked up anecdotally. I mean, I don't test these things. Dan may have run these things, but I think they're fairly. I've heard a lot of anecdotal commentary from people who aren't political, going, "Oh, geez, that's pretty good attack." So those are going to be the challenges. So both these leaders have a lot of pressure on them, and these campaigns have a lot of pressure to perform. But if they, and so the question will be, who can step up, who can rise to the challenge and get some momentum, and I think we'll be rewarded, rewarded by Canadians for it.
I'll add, Eric, two quick things to push back on the dichotomous red door, blue door narrative that the chattering classes seem to think only ever exist. Jack Layton did say, "Don't let them tell you it can't be done," and Democrats better take that to heart. And I'll also add, on the point of the re-incumbency in Ontario, and the incumbency for the re-election in Ontario, Jagmeet is he is the dean of the leaders. He is the only person who's been on a leadership debate stage of the leaders. That might work in his favor. Time will tell.
All right, we'll see. I wasn't expecting any of you to actually say who was going to win, but the fact that you guys can't just shows how much has changed since the last time we chatted. So we'll be chatting again during the campaign, and I think it is going to be definitely one that is going to be a lot more interesting than we were expecting. So really appreciate it, guys, and we'll talk again soon.
Happy to come back anytime and not answer your prediction question that you all pose to us every week.
I'll ask it one more time.
Last week.
Thanks, Eric.